Okay, hi everybody. Welcome. Thank you guys for coming to our latest series in our latest event in our book series. I'm Amanda Perry, and I am the executive director for the NACBS. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I am just going to briefly introduce Dane and Erik, and then I'm going to go ahead and let them take over for the discussion. And also, please keep your eye for our coming events, right? On November 1st, we'll have Vanessa Wilkie speaking about her newest work, A Woman of Influence. And then in December, Aruna Majata is going to be speaking about her latest book, Waiting on Empire. So you can keep your eye on the newsletter for updates about that or check our website. Today, we are so happy to have Erik and Dane with us. Dane is a historian of the British imperial world who has written many books, the most recent of which are The Imperial History Wars, Debating the British Empire in 2018, Decolonization, A Very Short Introduction in 2016, and The Last Blank Spaces, Exploring Africa and Australia in 2013. He's also co-edited several volumes, including How Empire Shaped Us in 2016. And his latest book, which we were just hearing a little bit about, is called Mungo Park's Ghosts, The Haunted Hubris of British Explorers in 19th Century Africa. And that is actually going to be coming out with Cambridge University Press later this year, or January, I think. And so we are here to discuss Erik's latest work. Erik Linstrum is a historian of modern Britain in its imperial, European, and global contexts. His research explores the politics of knowledge and the circulation of information with particular interests in science and technology, war and violence, and the long history of decolonization. His first book, Ruling Minds, Psychology in the British Empire, won the George Louis Beer Prize of the American Historical Association for Best Book of the Year in European International History. And today we are here to discuss his most recent work, Age of Emergency, Living with Violence at the End of the British Empire. And so Erik is going to speak for a few minutes, and then Dane is going to lead our discussion. So Erik, welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. These book launch events are terrific. I'm so glad NACBS is doing them, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Nice to see so many familiar and collegial faces. At least I can see your names in most cases. So thank you for being here. I really, really do appreciate it. I'm going to talk for maybe 15 minutes or so. I'll show some images from the book, then turn things over to Dane to say a few words and hopefully field some questions. So again, thanks all for being here. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. You can all see that, I assume. Okay, great. So there it is, my new book, Age of Emergency, which is a history of the home front of colonial war. It asks how information about violence perpetrated in the name of empire came back to Britain, or in other words, how knowledge about colonial violence was produced and circulated. It also asks how British individuals and institutions responded to the uneasy sense of involvement in distant atrocities which resulted from this. More specifically, the book looks at reactions to counterinsurgencies in Malaya, Kenya, and Cyprus in the 1950s. It therefore speaks to ongoing debates about the domestic impact, for lack of a better phrase, of decolonization. It also captures attitudes toward the use of force to defend empire at a moment when the continued existence of empire itself was no longer a foregone conclusion. So this was, I think, a transitional moment when feelings of moral responsibility for imperial subjects were strengthening in some ways, but attenuating in others. Let me say a little more now about the choice of case studies. First, and most obviously, these three conflicts, and especially the Mau Mau campaign in Kenya, have been at the forefront of a recent scholarly reevaluation of the place of violence in imperial history. Second, these conflicts belong to a moment of almost uninterrupted and what seemed to many contemporaries like an endless series of conflicts rather, that I call an age of emergency. For roughly 2 decades after 1945, a series of uprisings threatened British rule in colonies across the world. Tens of thousands of British soldiers were dispatched to one trouble spot after another. Officials often circulated between them and the same counterinsurgency playbook, including the use of torture, Forced population transfers, collective punishments, and summary executions were used again and again with uncertain results. These patterns produced a common vocabulary of criticisms and defenses in Britain, which helps to explain why Malaya, Kenya, and Cyprus were often rhetorically linked in British debates. But this repeated recourse to the use of force, coupled with less than triumphant outcomes from the British perspective, also explains another reason for uneasiness about colonial violence. This was the suspicion that brutality only dramatized the decline of Britain's global power rather than reversing it. In other words, it was this suspected futility of colonial violence that I think explains a lot of the unease it generated in this period. Historians have offered various justifications for downplaying the impact of colonial violence in Britain. The claim which recurs most often, both in scholarly and in public accounts, is that the imperial state succeeded in keeping the worst excesses of brutality a secret. So media histories, for instance, have detailed the formal and informal modes of censorship and the propaganda strategies which shaped press coverage to the advantage of the imperial military machine. And of course, as you all know, the disclosure in 2012 of the so-called migrated archives of colonial government files removed from dozens of British colonies at the time of decolonization and then held for decades at the Hanslope Park Intelligence Facility seemed to confirm this narrative about secrecy. This revelation seemed to confirm that reckoning with the colonial violence of earlier periods was a very recent phenomenon, made possible only by piercing the veil of secrecy through lawsuits and other recent acts of memory activism. And it's this assumption. It's the assumption that a state-controlled information economy functioned seamlessly as colonial wars were being waged that I want to challenge in my book. What I argue is that contemporary knowledge of colonial violence was, in fact, widespread in Britain. And so the book is structured around different communities or circles of knowing, a phrase I borrow from the sociologist Stanley Cohen, which created and disseminated this knowledge. Left-wing activists collected testimony from victims and witnesses of violence. They produced pamphlets and newsletters for a burgeoning world of radical print. They held meetings and marches aimed at seizing media attention and pressuring politicians to take action. Soldiers, for their part, wrote letters to their friends and families, sometimes bragging about or casually describing brutality, sometimes registering moral objections to it. A few published memoirs and novels based on their wartime experiences. Journalists recorded evidence in their notebooks. They swapped stories with colleagues and documented brutality with varying degrees of explicitness in print and on the airwaves. Missionaries and aid workers, who were always central to the ambition of capturing hearts and minds, of blending humanitarianism with coercion, these figures also witnessed atrocity and then drew colleagues back home into morally charged debates about the trade-offs of continuing to participate or speaking out. Playwrights, novelists, screenwriters, and others took audiences inside dramatized versions of detention camps and interrogation rooms. So through these various channels, some public, some private, some explicitly political, others nominally objective, some factual, others fictional, violence reached far beyond the conflict zones of empire. One way that my book, I think, reflects the challenge of writing British imperial history after Hanslope Park is that it uses state archives rather sparingly. I think the dynamics of secrecy and propaganda begin to seem less impressive once we map how knowledge about violence penetrated other institutions. And so I use the archives of religious institutions like the Society of Friends and the Church of England and various missionary groups, aid groups like the British Red Cross, media institutions like the Times, the Guardian, and the BBC. Likewise, the surprisingly extensive archives of public representations of colonial war, from articles and photographs to books and scripts. And I have to say, television scripts in particular, the scripts of television dramas proved to be a much more fruitful source than I would have expected when I started this project. That underscores, I think, just how much violence unfolded in plain sight. So ultimately, I argue the concept of secrecy and even the concept of the open secret is far too crude to describe the relationship between public and private knowledge of colonial violence. Of course, British officials at this time did often treat reports of brutality as secrets. They worked energetically and sometimes successfully to keep them out of the press. When politicians and humanitarian leaders and other influential figures learned about abuses through private channels, they often had a tendency to confer with government ministers behind closed doors rather than go public. But secrecy, as sociologists and others have taught us, is never simply a matter of suppressing information. It also draws attention to that information, weaves networks of complicity around it, confers a charged status on it. One reason for this in the 1950s is that the disturbing accounts which did emerge into public view were all the more disturbing because others were kept quiet. Another is that the never-ending work of managing secrecy, policing the boundaries of what could or should be described to the public, was never itself a secret. So a lot of the book has to do with these intermediary figures, the bureaucrats, the reporters, the missionaries, the soldiers, the settlers, who found themselves in the position of having to decide whether they should publicize what they knew or stay silent. And this arguably is the paradox of a liberal society. The transparency of debates about secrecy, the process of secrecy itself, is not entirely secret. Something that I came to appreciate over the course of writing the book is that treating colonial violence as a problem of knowledge helps to explain why awareness of brutality so rarely translated into action to stop it. Because of their location in the imperial power structure, those who had the clearest view of brutality also felt the strongest pressures to downplay or justify it. What is sometimes called the circumscribed morality of institutions and professions, from the military and the civil service to the press and the churches and the aid organizations, was always shaping knowledge about violence. And so abstract questions about right and wrong slipped quickly into murkier dilemmas about burdens of proof and standards of evidence, about where responsibility should be assigned and who should do the assigning, about the trade-offs between working within the system and criticizing it from outside. This brings me to what the book has to offer, hopefully, to debates within and beyond British studies in terms of debates on humanitarianism, distant suffering, and the relationship between violence and modernity. Since the Holocaust, of course, there's been an influential narrative promoted by figures like Hannah Arendt and Zygmunt Bauman, who have argued that modernity itself is what makes atrocity possible. By fragmenting responsibility across specialized roles and compartmentalized institutions, by insulating perpetrators from the flesh and blood consequences of their actions, by transforming unsettling face-to-face encounters into remote, impersonal, bureaucratic acts. And I do think, of course, there's a measure of truth to this. This is one way of telling the story of colonial war, a story about technology, bureaucracy, and other hallmarks of modernity, at least furnishing the resources for the normalization of colonial violence. What I think this narrative misses is that modernity, bureaucracy, technology in particular, also made violence a problem to be reckoned with in the first place. So while some technologies like aerial bombardment may have put war at a distance, others like television drew it closer. Even as some institutions filed evidence of violence away, they also transmitted it across time and space. And so far from evading a sense of involvement in colonial violence, I think people in Britain were repeatedly confronted by it. The networks of imperial modernity brought them into vivid contact with the front lines. So much of the book then is concerned with cataloging the tactics or the scripts which contemporaries employed to deflect concerns about brutality. I think this was a highly conscious, often highly visible confrontation with uncomfortable truths. One of my aims in writing the book was to take seriously both the claims of the new imperial history and the revisionist scholarship on colonial violence that I've already mentioned. In other words, how does British history look different if we acknowledge that empire was central to Britain and that violence was central to empire? Or I might put this in a more pointed way by asking, how can we write histories which make clear that colonial violence was British violence? And I think the answer to those questions will depend largely on the choice of case studies. It will vary from period to period and conflict to conflict. So by way of conclusion, I just want to talk about some of the factors that I think made colonial violence particularly difficult to ignore in Britain in the period after 1945. And the first of these is the legacy of the First World War itself. Let's see if I can move this again. Oops, there we go. So to be sure, the Second World War does not impart any clear-cut lessons about state violence as far as contemporaries are concerned, but there is a widespread belief that Britain had fought a good war in moral terms against Germany, and this clearly complicated responses to counterinsurgency. As you can see from this newspaper excerpt, it's the Fife Free Press, if you can't read that in the corner. Critics of colonial war decried what they called Gestapo tactics or totalitarian methods or Nazi methods. These were almost standard critiques over the course of the 1950s. And I'll add that these were genuinely unnerving parallels if you look at tactics like collective punishment, which had been condemned during the war against Germany and then employed in the wars of the 1950s. And even in private, many conservative figures, for instance, Lawrence Durrell, who was working for the colonial government in Cyprus, acknowledged what he saw as the fascist undertones and the fascist qualities of colonial war. So that's one factor. A second is that these wars, the colonial wars of the 1950s, were fought in significant measure by conscripts as well as career soldiers. And I think this is really a first in the history of colonial war. And this is part of the story, of course, of national service. With conscripts circulating in and out of conflict zones, the knowledge they produced, their testimony, photographs, and other forms of evidence reached far beyond the world of professional fighting men. The codes of silence that might exist within a regiment simply don't work as well when you have non-career soldiers moving in and out of military institutions. While some critics of colonial war at the time saw conscription as an engine of militarization, they thought this was propelling families across the country to identify more closely with the armed forces and therefore react defensively to accusations of brutality. I think the reality was more ambiguous. Conscription widened the circle of involvement in colonial war. It generated a sense of complicity, at least potentially, along with feelings of solidarity. Third, the age of colonial emergency was also a golden age of communication in many ways. Old-fashioned informational channels between Britain and its colonies, especially mail, transmitted huge volumes of information about colonial war. The 1950s are actually the peak period for overseas mail volume for Britain. But I think the vividness, the immediacy that ushers colonial war into British homes in this period is largely a product of other media. Newspapers, which are never more widely read than they are in the 1950s, and also are beginning to use photographs more routinely than they ever had before. Illustrated weeklies like the Picture Post. You see here a Bert Hardy photograph from the Picture Post from 1952, which is to say some of the most celebrated photojournalists of the day were visiting these conflicts and publishing photographs from them. And of course, the electronic media of radio and especially television, which I've also already briefly mentioned. A fourth and final factor here is that waves of migration from the colonies after 1948 recast debates about colonial war as struggles over British identity. And I think this is what makes many of these debates so charged and so emotive. Obviously, migrants from Malaya and Kenya and Cyprus had the most direct stake in these conflicts. Greek Cypriots were by far the most numerous and That sort of helps to explain why there's so much lobbying around the war in Cyprus in particular. The Malayan and Kenyan communities are much smaller, but they're dominated by university students, particularly in London, and are therefore quite intensely politicized. But at the same time, the wider universe of Black Britons from many parts of the empire constitutes a new social base for anti-colonial politics. And it's always remarked by observers, including the special branch officers who would attend anti-colonial meetings, that somewhere between a third and two-thirds of those who are attending these meetings, usually in London, were Black. So there is a new constituency, I think, for debates about empire and the morality of empire as the 1950s goes on. So along with the global backdrop of decolonization, I think these forces helped to ensure that the legal states of emergency, which are being declared in the colonies, are also going to threaten to become moral emergencies in Britain. And while I think in the end that apologists for brutality end up succeeding for the most part in containing that sense of crisis, it's still important to take a close look at the extraordinary range of justifications and rationalizations which were required to accomplish this. In other words, how Britons learned to live with the violence they could not simply ignore is the story of the book. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing what Dane has to say and to hopefully answering some questions. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'm on now, am I?
You are.
Okay. First of all, it's really a pleasure to take part in this book launch, and I want to thank you, Erik, for inviting me to do so. First thing I want to say is this is an important book. It overturns the second of two exceptionalist narratives that had persisted for decades, but which have come, one of which has now been overturned, but now Erik is overturning the second. The first of these exceptionalist narratives is one that casts the British withdrawal from empire as more peaceful, more carefully managed, more successful than say the French. Particularly the French is always the counterpart here, but other European empires as well. And over the past decade, that narrative has been pretty much demolished by a whole series of scholars, culminating perhaps in Carolyn Elkins and her work, Legacy of Violence. But there's a second exceptionalist narrative, which has been tied to the first one, which until now has persisted. And it really claims that the British at home were essentially unaware of this violence, that they paid little attention to it, that they got little information about it. And what makes, I think, Erik's book so important is that it systematically and effectively refutes that narrative. And what he demonstrates is that the evidence of this knowledge was in fact hiding in plain sight in all sorts of venues. And that's one of the things that's so remarkable. So what he does in this book is, well, he makes this case in an elegantly written, analytically penetrating book that is grounded in a prodigious amount of research. And I think you can get a sense for the analytical nuance and sophistication of his argument from the presentation that he's given us today. I think it's important to stress that at the heart of the book is really a moral inquiry, right? He argues that the age of emergency, as the title puts it, was a moral emergency for the British public. And it's one that required them to confront the violence and atrocities that were carried out in their name. He shows that by living with violence, and that's the subtitle or part of the subtitle, Living with Violence, they made moral compromises. And those moral compromises occurred among various groups. He has a wonderful section on the Anglican Church, a chapter on the Anglican Church and the Red Cross, for example, and how they struggled with these moral issues and how they basically sort of shoved them aside, but various other groups, journalists and the like. And the result is really a penetrating ethical history, social history, and cultural history of the domestic responses to decolonization. It's not a political history, which leads me, in fact, to my first question. This is one area where arguably the exceptionalist narrative may still hold true. And so my question is, why did the British political system manage to remain essentially unchallenged, undisturbed by what so many people knew was taking place at this crisis of empire? I mean, especially, and here's where the comparison with the French again sort of becomes so transparent. You know, the French system leads to a coup attempt and the collapse of the Fourth Republic, and yet in the British political system, everything seems to be going along relatively swimmingly. And the only real crisis that occurs over Suez, as you point out, which is a very different case. So I would like to throw out that question first, but let me also, I realize I should have said at the beginning, please, everyone else who has questions, my main role is to serve as moderator here and to facilitate these questions. So I guess, throw up your hand, virtually through Zoom, or write a comment or question, I guess, in the comments section. Amanda can perhaps help me with this, but in any case, let me start with my question about the politics, and then we'll go from there. Okay.
Sounds good. So should I do some answering, or should we?
Yes.
Collect? Oh, no, okay. Well, I'll fill the airtime as best I can. Yeah, no, it's a good question, Dane, and I think, yeah, in part as you maybe suggested, my approach here was to try to write a counter narrative to the political narratives, which are indeed all about the relative placidity of high politics. Yes, these questions are raised periodically in Parliament, but typically by a fairly narrow sliver of Labour Party leftists. The conservative leaders who preside over most of these atrocities, though not all, seem to really pay no political price for them. And so, yeah, I suppose one argument of the book is that, at least, where the conservatives are concerned, things weren't quite as placid as they might seem. And so that's why I do spend some time talking about far-right groups like the League of Empire Loyalists, which, although they were quite small, I think do reveal a sort of leading edge of ethno-nationalism, revanchism, real bitterness about the retreat from empire, which was not just confined to those groups. I don't put a lot of this in the book, but there's lots of evidence of ordinary conservative voters writing to conservative politicians and combining a certain anguish about decolonization, and particularly what they see as selling out white settlers in places like Kenya, with concern about immigration, which would be maybe another issue where we might say, on the surface, things are relatively placid in terms of the high politics of immigration in the 1950s, but in fact, we know there's a lot going on beneath the surface in terms of popular angst. And I think that confluence, I mean, one of the things I argue in the book is that, whereas we tend to credit immigration as being a more significant and powerful issue in British politics after the 1950s than decolonization, I think they're very closely linked. And I think in both cases, you have a kind of racial idea of the nation that's being articulated, a sense of racial threat, a sense of betrayal by leaders who are too liberal, whether it's, Macmillan or, of course, the labor leaders. And so these arguments are being made. You see them in the letters pages of newspapers. You see them in the letters that are written to politicians. It's true that they're not registering yet in electoral terms, and I'm not sure I do have a great answer for why that is. I think there are just so many other issues, particularly domestic economic issues, that are ultimately decisive. But I don't think I would completely buy your premise that politics is unaffected by angst about the end of empire. Again, the French case is so beguiling, but it's also so extreme in many ways that I think it can mislead us into mistaking what is quite a lot going on beneath the surface. I believe it's Lord Halifax who's quoted in the book saying to other conservatives that while the Conservative Party leadership understands that you can no longer keep the British Empire at bay with a Maxim gun, ordinary conservative voters don't yet understand that. And so what I would say is what you really see in this period is the beginning of a rift between conservative voters and conservative elites. And of course, immigration is part of it, but I think insufficient toughness and ruthlessness to defend empire is part of it as well. And that angst, that sense of bitterness, ressentiment, if you'd like, is going to go somewhere after the 1950s. I think much of it is going to end up in an anti-immigrant key.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I actually agree with you. I think that's the case, and in fact it persists for a long time, and even sort of resonates with the Brexit campaign and its aftermath. So yeah, I mean, there are political dimensions to this story too, even though you don't address them in your book. So, are there others who have questions? I mean, I certainly do, but I want to sort of open this up if there's anyone else here who I'm looking to see if anyone is raised. Yeah, Richard, go for it.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Erik, for that succinct and very neat introduction to your book, which I will look forward to reading. I guess maybe I'm the only one here who actually remembers those days, or has some memories of those days. And one of the things that I remember from it was, in fact, that empire was never out of the news, and the violence of empire was never out of the news. And I think, so I would ask you whether you would, how you would think of this period in the longer context of the way in which empire, empire violence creates uneasiness within the society and creates debate within British society from the beginning of the empire. Of course, this is the case. So, I think we're actually currently in danger of privileging violence maybe a bit too much in its raw form, and ignoring or losing sight of the way in which this was not something that was, easily swept under the carpet or easily ignored in British society. And in fact, it was part of the discourse of empire, as I say, throughout the ages. So the question is, my question would be, how would you see this as different in that respect from this period, the end of empire period, as different in that respect from earlier periods?
Yeah, a very good question, and nice to see you, Richard. Thanks for coming. Well, I tried to start answering that question. I do think there are factors that make violence more salient and more unsettling. Again, I think the Second World War is crucial, because although we know in terms of the international organizations and treaties that come out of the war, there's certainly no consistent effort to constrain empires from using violence. I do think in the popular understanding of the war in Britain, and again, this is something you see in letters that are written to officials, as letters to newspapers again and again, there's a perception that a war was just fought against an enemy that did underhanded things like collective punishments. So collective punishment is an example of something that has a very long history in the British Empire. It's probably something that always occasions maybe some criticism, but I think that criticism becomes sharpened, and I also think it's more widespread because we have this very recent example of a war that was fought against an enemy which used it and was criticized for doing so. So that is one point. I won't rehearse all the other points I just made. I do think media is very significant, and I think although photography is not just invented in the 1950s, of course, this is really the period in which media technology, or at least somewhat recently before this period, media technology allows photographs to be printed frequently and cheaply and broadly disseminated in newspapers and magazines. And I'm not sure that you see anything like, for instance, the bandaged heads of ordinary Cypriots, which I showed briefly in the presentation, which was an image that was widely displayed in newsreels and newspapers and so on. That was in Famagusta in 1958, after a British soldier's wife was murdered. British soldiers, effectively went on a rampage, and five Cypriots were killed and many were injured. So I do think media is quite significant and making this harder to ignore. And then finally, I'll just change in between, but I do think the Suez Crisis might actually be quite significant along the way. At a certain point, the question is, what are we fighting for? And is this a futile battle? And because of that global context, I do think it becomes harder to defend brutality, above all for its pointlessness or its brutality. So it's one thing to engage in brutality if you're helping to preserve a kind of world order, but if that world order is already beginning to fall apart, I think it becomes much harder to justify. So I take your point. It's not as if unease with violence is new. I would say there are a few different factors that are pushing toward an intensification of that uneasiness in this period. But I would love someone to write a history of uneasiness about, tactics during the Boer War. I know you've done a bit of that yourself. Maybe those histories can still be written. As I say, I may perhaps be guilty of picking the low-hanging fruit, and that this is a period in which these concerns were uniquely salient and omnipresent, but I'm not fully ready to make that argument.
Okay, I see several hands up. Michelle, I'll turn to you next.
Thanks, Dane. And thanks, Eric. What a terrific presentation. Thank you, Amanda, for organizing this as always. I wanted to ask you about method. I love your point about the media bringing this home, but I'm thinking of your last image, which to me looks almost like a staged of the man pointing the gun at the completely vulnerably naked man. And it almost looks like it could come from a movie. I would not call that an empathetic image. It's not one that sort of evokes empathy, but rather it shows that power dynamic of empire in its kind of almost in its most voyeuristic kind of way. And so my question about method is this: when you're reading the Friends, I love the Friends archive. It's one of my when you're reading them, there's a particular point of view there. But when you're reading the sort of media images, how is it that you can then gear or gauge what people are thinking about those images and how they're playing? Because there is an element here of these images filling copy on newspapers. And that if you have like the theater images, those are explicitly fictionalized. So in the realm of culture, how then do we gauge how a public is, if the people aren't in the streets protesting against and the Cyprus stuff is really, I think, really poignant, but if they're not out in the streets protesting against this, but rather consuming it as a product, how can we then gauge this question of moral quandary or empathy? Because it's the audience reception question, I guess. And I wondered how you did that in the book. It sounds really, it sounds really important, and I'd be very curious. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, Michelle. It's a really smart question. So I will say a big part of the chapter on popular culture, on theater and television, which is really the focus of those, of drama and both on stage and on the small screen. The punchline of the chapter ends up being that these forms, I think, did end up serving more as a kind of catharsis, a way to kind of indulge a guilty conscience and then walk away, than a kind of meaningful political action. And that's probably contrary to the hopes of many of the people who wrote these works to begin with, which I can document to some extent. So I try to walk that line. There was I think an important effort to try to use these forums to raise awareness. In terms of producing copy to fill time and space, I completely take your point, and I argue that's one of the reasons why I think teleplays in particular were so subversive in this period, because BBC and ITV literally had hours to fill every week, with these new television playhouse kind of shows, which were anthology series. So a kind of the idea of a different perspective every week is sort of built into the form. And so almost anyone who could write a halfway competent script had a very good chance of getting it produced and on the air, which is why it's so multivocal, it's so polyvalent. You get so many different voices, and some of them are quite critical of war. That said, as I say, you can certainly read them more critically. So the television dramas are very gritty, and don't really pull many punches, I don't think, on the brutality that's being used, but they do end up being more about the effects of that brutality on British soldiers than on anyone else. And so it becomes a kind of parable of brutalization, and it becomes a story about the dangers of what these wars are doing to our boys. Not an insignificant concern, but also a very self-referential concern. I could give a few other examples. I think, Wole Soyinka is a really interesting case. Of course, he's Nigerian, but then, like many West Africans who are students and activists, becomes very invested in the Kenya cause in particular, particularly after, Ghana and Nigeria are sort of set on a path toward mostly nonviolent independence. And so Soyinka is part of this avant-garde performance that's staged after the Hola Camp massacre at the Royal Court Theatre in London, which is effectively just involves performing the scenes that are described in the parliamentary report on the Hola massacre. And Soyinka later writes about this, and he says at a certain point during the performance, he began to feel uncomfortable and wondering if sort of reenacting in a kind of dreamlike way the massacre was actually just repeating the injury, as he says, rather than kind of raising consciousness about it. So he's quite conscious of that, and I think that that's another form of uneasiness that's here. It's how do you get people to care about these things without either desensitizing them, to get to your point about voyeurism, or giving them the kind of maybe cheap, satisfying feeling of having reckoned with something difficult and then being able to walk away from it. So to me, there's not really an easy answer here. I think it's better to have these things being discussed than not, but it's difficult to gauge what the political upshot of these things was ultimately. Just a quick final point. There's more I could say about voyeurism, but I'll try to stop talking. BBC audience research did help a bit with this question of audience research, and so it was very interesting to hear some of the more subversive teleplays, viewers saying, boy, I didn't expect to hear this Mau Mau propaganda, on my television set, about how the poor Africans have been oppressed and the British are the bad guys. So they got the political message on some level and were offended by it. That's not to say then that it leads to a more meaningful form of political engagement, but ultimately, I think that is kind of the story of this period, and maybe, dare I say, our own period, a kind of uneasy passivity where we're hyper aware of atrocity and other bad things happening, but feel sort of powerless to stop it and are engaging mostly as information consumers rather than political actors. So I guess I would say part of the book is actually trying to get at the formation of that postmodern subject, dare I say, if I wanted to be really, really lofty about it. But yeah, it's a great question. Thank you.
Guy?
Hi, Eric. Congratulations. This is a really nice event too. It's obviously a tremendously significant book. I have two questions. One is about the narrative, the origins of the narrative of domestic ignorance. The second of the two kind of frameworks, the one that Dane says that you knock down so effectively, and I'm sure you do. But I just wonder, like, given what you've recovered, what is the process by which we ever inherited in the first place? A narrative of ignorance, especially maybe in historiography. I mean, this is a slightly different version of the same question, but so you could answer either one. But is it a process of historical writing that you recover that actually minimized and dismissed this, and how does that happen given the kind of efflorescence of evidence that you've obviously turned up? Um, and then my second question would be about, just thinking kind of, you made that remark towards the end about our own situation today. The first 20 years of this century were characterized by an American war in Afghanistan. And I could imagine a future historian, in like 60 years, writing a book and saying how American culture was suffused with awareness of all of the atrocities that the American state was perpetuating in Afghanistan. I suppose they could find evidence for that. There'd be certain Netflix shows and so on. But I have to say, having lived through it, it doesn't feel like this culture has really been confronted with what I imagine a future historian could find evidence of. And so I don't know, how do you think through that kind of parallel, or if that's not helpful?
Thanks, Guy. Thanks for coming. Thanks for your questions. I think I'll take a whack at the second one first. So I guess I disagree, not really about Afghanistan, but when I give more autobiographical accounts of how I came to write this, and quasi auto psychoanalytic accounts of how I came to write this, and want to write about this grim stuff, I always think of Abu Ghraib. I think of the war in Iraq, and I think about that scandal about photography, and that scandal about ordinary soldiers, and what that says about Americans. Now, I mean, maybe that's something that we've been collectively quite eager to forget and move on from, but that was quite formative for me, at the time, and still haunts me in a way. So I take your point. There's a great will to forget, and the book ultimately could be seen. The epilogue of my book is in some ways about the forgetting, in some ways that takes place after these events took place. Although I think even that's maybe slightly question, I guess. So if there's all this evidence around why was it ignored, I do think Dane's question about politics explains a large part of that, which is to say, so much of the history of decolonization was traditionally done from the vantage point of high very easy to be impressed by, wow, Britain gave away an empire and there wasn't much fuss. This didn't figure in any of the election campaigns of the period. The party elites were quite, had a large degree of consensus around this. So that's my best explanation, but I don't think it's a totally sufficient explanation. I do think, you have to begin to think about, why, the history of empire has shifted from a political history, broadly speaking, to a cultural history, and that then catches some of these artifacts that maybe would have been ignored otherwise. But again, you can look at things like soldiers' letters, which I would consider to be part of a traditional kind of military war and society political history, which people have not looked at. And it's just an eternal reminder, I guess, that violence has become something that perhaps was once seen as a natural part of empire and a natural part of politics, and now is something that seems to require explanation, or at least attention, in a way that it didn't. But the final point I'll make is that I think there is, since this recent reevaluation, particularly about Kenya, particularly the controversies around, Carrie Elkin's book, and to a lesser extent, David Anderson's book. Well, one point I make there is that the reception of those books, and Elkin's in particular, I think in some ways replicates the very dynamics that we're talking about. So Elkin's book could be criticized both on the grounds that, we already all knew this anyway, and on the other, can we really be sure that all this stuff happened? Is this just, Africans telling tales, and that sort of thing. So, and then maybe somewhere in between is the response, why are we dwelling on these morbid details? So, I think that's kind of an interesting glimpse into the psychology that takes place here. But more than that, I do think, because scholarship has now begun to engage with violence in a way that it hadn't before, there is the danger of a narrative of revelation and disclosure, and a kind of coming to consciousness that I think is part of a broader, maybe meta narrative around decolonization now. It's only now that we're beginning to reckon with empire, which is perhaps true in some ways, but I think it's manifestly untrue in other ways. And in a way, that can become a means of letting people off the hook in the past, because I do think it's cartoonish to say either everyone was on board with these kinds of things that were happening, or they were completely ignorant of them. There was a very active and uneasy kind of engagement with these questions. The most influential narrative around secrecy and ignorance actually might be Paul Gilroy's essay, Post-Colonial Melancholia, which goes pretty heavy into this narrative. So post-Elkins, post-Hanslope Park, and talks about this idea of a kind of hidden trove of colonial horrors that's only kind of now bursting open. So why people are so invested in that idea, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure, but it does seem to have gained new credence with some of the recent, revisionist scholarship.
Okay. So we have 3 hands up, and I think maybe given how little time we have, why don't we ask each of them to ask their question, and then Erik, you can respond accordingly as best you can. So why don't we start with Hillary, then we'll go to Andrew, and then Amy, who also wrote her question in the chat function. Okay.
Sure, I'll be really brief because I think my question dovetails maybe a little bit with Amy's. I haven't finished the last chapters of the book yet, Erik, so forgive me if you address this, but I'm so excited for this. It's like the book that my survey class has been like waiting for. But part of the language of emergency that you talk about, right, is the attempt to limit emergency in the colonies and to make the metropole a space of normalcy, right? But you also talk about the role of migration to some extent, right? I know you talk about the League of Empire Loyalists, but if we're thinking more, not League of Empire Loyalists, but groups that are talking about emergencies of migration within, right, the metropole, are those the same languages of emergency? Are they different? How do you reconcile that together?
Okay, thank you, Amy. Andrew, you want to raise your question?
Hi there. Hello. I'll turn my camera on. I wanted to ask about, you mentioned conscripts and national servicemen, and that was one reason why maybe it couldn't be contained or it couldn't be kept secret or whatever, that there was this thing of, people were going out, they were coming home again. I was wondering if you thought that had any impact. Obviously, it had an impact in a kind of domestic sphere, like you talked about soldiers' letters and things like that. I was wondering if you were aware of that having any impact on a wider, like, political sphere or anything, whether the conscripts and the servicemen kind of got to a higher level than just, writing letters to their families. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And then Amy.
Yeah, hey, thank you for this event. Yeah, so I put my question in the chat, although I think it's a lot of the discussion has in some ways addressed it. But what I'm really trying to get at is, I think, what this very important question that you're raising, Erik, about really the teleology of how we tell 20th century history, which is, we all know the empire is going to fall. So didn't everybody already also know that? And I love the way that you're contrasting the different archives of, if you look at the politics, well, maybe, or if you look at certain political conversations, well, maybe, but in the cultural realm, and especially popular culture, I think you're making a very strong case. And as we've seen with recent events in Britain, that the empire was still very, very much a part of the popular imagination. So what I was trying to get at, my question is exactly as Hillary was talking about, this question of, is violence acceptable in an emergency situation? That is, it's an emergency, but then we're going to get back to quote unquote normal when this level of violence is not required. And, as a 19th centurist, I'm just kind of very familiar with the, like, Joseph Chamberlain, like, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. So yeah, so thank you again.
Great. Thank you for all these questions. Let me try to answer the question about national servicemen first, because I think it might be the most discreet and in a way straightforward to answer. So I didn't find any, for instance, activist groups that were founded just by national servicemen, but several do become sort of prominent dissidents. David Larter is one who becomes a kind of active figure in the Communist Party of Great Britain and lectures about his experience in Kenya. But more generally, and I can't remember now if Lardner is one of them, there are records of conscientious objection to national service. Unfortunately, the records of the tribunals are not complete. And we're talking about a relatively small fraction, a fraction of 1% of everyone who's called up who did actually register as a CO. And then, of course, a large proportion of those would have done so on sort of universally pacifist grounds, often religious grounds, which is the best way of actually getting an exemption. But there are also fragmentary records of people who objected to fighting in colonial wars for various reasons, and there are different rationales that are given for that. Some quite clearly are coming from the left and believe that war for empire, particularly a war to defend settlers in Kenya or planters in Malaya, is illegitimate. Others argue that conscription should only really be used in a war of overwhelming national interest and national survival, and that's clearly not the case with these conflicts. In one case, there was a migrant from British Guiana who refused to fight, who registered as a CO because he objected to participating in the colonial war against other Black populations, as he put it. And I'm paraphrasing, but that was the thrust of his objection. So that's where I see a lot of that sort of political energy going. Again, there were national servicemen who participated in other groups, particularly on the far left. But that's sort of where I trace that story for the most part. Okay, on the question of exceptional violence and longer histories of violence, that's really interesting. I guess the part of the story my mind goes to in response to that is the sort of right-wing backlash against criticism of colonial war. And there's quite a lot of it, and I document this. You see it in the letters pages of newspapers. You see it also in far-right groups like the League of Empire Loyalists. You also see it in this genre of really gory war writing, some of it written by former soldiers, some of it not, which I call counterinsurgency pulp, really, often explicit and disturbing stuff, which I think is aimed at sort of initiating the public into the idea that these are dirty wars. Yes, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, but also you can't fight an insurgency without adopting some of the same underhanded techniques as the insurgents. So you see a lot of that. You also see a surprising number of sort of right-wing apologists for violence calling back to the Amritsar massacre and using that as an example of overwhelming force that was successful and decisive. And there's this idea that if we could only have a General Dyer given a free hand in Cyprus or Malaya for a few months, then he'd be able to put things right relatively quickly. So there's a pervasive myth on the right that the military has its hands tied and is not being permitted to sort of use violence freely. So that's sort of, I hope at least part of an answer to your question. Yeah, Hillary, on migration and the language of emergency, that's so interesting. I have to say I'm quite taken, and maybe having finished the book now, I'm more taken than I was before with Bill Schwartz's argument about the re-racialization of Britain and the fact, I think, that so much of the language of settler colonialism in particular, and this idea of a kind of besieged enclave and, insidious racial threats lurking all around, travels pretty seamlessly from the coverage of what's going on in Kenya to the language that's then adopted in terms of responses to migration, particularly non-white migration at home. Likewise, the language of the far right in terms of a kind of weak or sickly liberalism, handicapping the war effort and preventing the British from defending themselves, I think it's translated into the debate about immigration. Again, a kind of liberal weakness that's sapping the foundations of the nation. I was actually kind of surprised to learn just how pervasive all of that language was. So I think we're just about out of time, so I'll stop there, but I wish I could say more. These are all terrific questions.
Okay, we are out of time, and I think I'll hand it back to Amanda for closing, whatever closing remarks.
Yeah, sure. No, I'll just thank everyone for coming. Thank you so much, Eric. This was such a wonderful talk, and thank you, Dane, for your comments and for moderating. Thanks everyone for coming, and please check the newsletter for our next events. We hope to see you guys at a bunch of these. So,
thank you, everyone. That was great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Dane.
Yep. Thank you.
Eric.
Yeah.